Buenos dias, good morning. It's nice to be with you in video form at least, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you in Montevideo in person. I'd like to talk to you this morning about the work that we're doing in the Centre for Innovation in Parliament, and particularly around the World e-Parliament report and the trends that we're seeing for digital tools and digital technologies across parliaments. What's digital done for parliaments in the last 10 years? What are the key trends and opportunities that digital's offering to parliaments and parliamentarians right now? And what are the challenges that these tools are leading to for parliaments? What's the thing that we have to try and overcome if we're to get full use and real value out of digital tools? And it's clear that these tools are valuable, that they're important, and they're changing the way that Parliament works and the relationship that parliaments have with the public. But they come at a cost, not just financial cost, but also a skills and training and opportunity cost. So what are those issues that we're looking at the moment, and where are the things going? Where's the trend for digital technology in Parliament? In 10 years' time, perhaps. I don't know if we can predict that far out, but certainly in a few years' time, 3-4 years, where are we going to be using technology more or less? What are we seeing? So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I'm going to give you some of the key trends from the World e-Parliament report, which was published in December 2018. And these will hopefully give you some ideas about things you can look at in your own parliaments and compare the work that you're doing in your own parliaments with the global situation. Digital technologies are now firmly established within parliaments, and they come in many cases with clear governance processes and with vision statements and strategic plans. We've seen a growth over the last 10 to 12 years in the number of strategic planning exercises being undertaken by parliaments, and it's now safe to say that technology has established itself as a business as usual function within almost all parliaments. Because of that, we've also seen a shift from the strong political leadership that's been required in the early days of information technology through to a more managerial and internal leadership approach. So we've seen technology shift from having political pressure to digitise parliaments through to it now being an operational and strategic requirement of the institution itself. Although we haven't seen a lack of political support for technology, in fact, quite the opposite. There's still strong political support for this, but we've left it to the institution itself rather than the members to drive that technology change as the technology becomes more and more embedded in the institution. And this is reflected as well in the types of systems that we're seeing within Parliament. So increasingly parliaments have end-to-end legislative management systems that are able to encapsulate the drafting and processing of legislation through the parliamentary process. So this can include drafting amendments and taking variations on votes and content of the legislation as it passes through the chamber or chambers of the Parliament, and it can record and map and track how those changes came about and the votes that took place in committee stage and at plenary stage for that to happen. These are of course complex systems, and they bring with them some complex underlying technologies. So where we've seen the advancement of open technologies like extensible markup language, XML, this has been driven to a large degree by the adoption of sophisticated legislative management systems. And so the two go hand in hand. Where we see a public desire for openness, we see a technological solution provided by way of the legislative management system. So it's been a useful hand-in-glove approach to that, but this brings with it a number of challenges, not least that these systems are complex and expensive. So the cost of purchasing this system and in setting it up and installing it, having it up and running and adapted into the legislative process is significant, both in terms of finance but also in terms of skills and resources. You have to have some fairly specialised skills to do this, and it changes the process itself. So it's not just a case of overlaying a system. One has to think about how those systems are going to fit within the process that the Parliament has for drafting and passing legislation. So that's complicated. But also the complexity comes from the fact that a lot of parliaments are finding that the staff with the skills needed to run these systems are not available. In the big parliaments in major capitals, they are wanted equally in other institutions. So typically you look at the UK, thinking that London would have a surfeit of technology people, but they're working in banks, they're working in other public institutions. And you look at smaller countries and smaller parliaments, they just don't have the staff. So we have to look at how we resource parliaments to adapt and adopt these new complex systems that are core parts of their legislative process, but have to be maintained. By way of an example of the adoption of technology over the last 12 years, we can see this in this graphic that parliaments are now increasingly using digital technologies to capture the plenary record. This has shifted from very much a manual process where the traditional model we think of people taking notes on notepads and transcribing them later, through to a number of parliaments, 14% in fact, that are using digital technologies directly from the audio to use voice recognition and create a digital record from that. This has increased from 8%, so it's a slow rise, but we can see that technology is starting to move forward. And 71% of parliaments around the world that we surveyed are using a digital tool in some format for producing the plenary record. The big adoptive technology in terms of parliaments is just like anywhere else. It's social media and messaging tools. We've seen a significant rise in the use of social media, going from virtually nothing when the first World e-Parliament report came out, through to significant uses in all institutions and across both members and the institution today. What we see is the rise in the use of tools like Facebook and Twitter, which are ways of communicating with the public and both engaging and publishing information. So we've seen a shift from Parliament as publisher through to Parliament as publisher with a intent to draw people in, through to Parliament and members using digital tools to actually engage in conversations about current topical issues with the wider public. And we've seen a rise too, just like in the rest of society, in instant messaging tools, particularly tools like WhatsApp, but we're also seeing more niche tools such as Telegram, which is a more private, secure messaging service. And particularly for members, this is an interesting way of keeping close contact with a group of people who are interested in what you do. I was going to say supporters, but I think that's stretching it because these conversations are not always positive. But with instant messaging, it's a way of getting instant feedback. It's a way of polling very quickly views on a subject that is being debated. And it's a way of calibrating a member's own knowledge and understanding of a subject. It's a powerful tool for very fast communication. But that comes with also the risk of overload. And we've seen with all social networks that the requirements to manage these networks is quite significant, and the resources available to parliamentarians is not really increasing at the same rate as the messaging capacity that the tools have. So we're seeing challenges for members in particular, but also for institutions in terms of how we manage that digital platform for communication. But it's certainly safe to say now that social media and instant messaging tools are a business as usual tool for Parliament. So where we've seen on the institutional side the more complex technologically based legislative management systems, on the public facing side we now see social media and messaging tools as complementing those and complementing the work of Parliament and members of Parliament. Email remains the go-to tool for institutions and for members, and in this graphic we look at the tools that members use to communicate with the public, and 3/4 of them are using email. It's not surprising, it's been around for a long time, and it remains the preferred option for members of Parliament talking to the public, I think because it's able to be processed in a more asynchronous way and allows for a more qualitatively useful discussion. Coming hot on the heels though is Facebook. Over 60% of members now have some form of presence on Facebook and use it for something or other in their professional lives. Now, that's not to say that this is live and interactive. A lot of them will be using it for publishing information about meetings, about things that are going on, for reporting on what they're doing, and for posting videos and documents. So Facebook is not necessarily a two-way interactive tool. It's still very much used and seen by a lot of members of Parliament as a publishing tool. But we're shifting that conversation to become more two-way, and that's seen in the next statistic there, which is the adoption by over half of members of Parliament of tools such as WhatsApp. And that's where we do bring direct messaging to members of Parliament and bring live conversation to them and their constituents or other interested parties. The broadcasting of Parliament is not new. We've seen radio and television broadcasts of Parliament for a very long time, and the broadcasting of Parliament on television remains pretty much steady amongst parliaments around the world, but we have seen a fall in the use of radio. What we've seen in its place is the rise of digital, and this is both live digital streaming of parliamentary and committee sessions, and also the archive of broadcasting. So the archive has now moved online, if you like. The history of what's being said in Parliament has moved from a broadcast at the time, and occasionally you might be able to find that in some pre-recording, through to live feeds and archives available for the public directly to search. And this is a significant change when we think about access to parliamentary information. As well as the written record, we now have in a lot of parliaments live real-time access to a whole archive of video footage that's streamed live over the internet when we want it. We're also seeing a rise in the collaboration amongst parliaments and civil society organisations. There's a strong growth in this trend right across the world, but we've seen this being led in Latin America by the work that's happened with a number of parliamentary monitoring organisations and parliaments on the continent. This is now being mirrored across Europe and into Africa. And we're starting to see the value of these relationships in that the PMOs are able to support parliaments in thinking about who the audience might be and in proposing approaches to publishing data and making information and details of parliamentary sessions accessible to a much wider audience. There are examples too of where parliaments lack the resources that the PMOs have been able to offer support and technological backup to make information available that parliaments simply could not do themselves, either because they didn't have the resources or they didn't know how to at the time. So this is a positive relationship. We're seeing a really strong relationship. It's not the adversarial one a lot of people thought would happen or argue is the case. I think it's overwhelmingly a positive, where civil society organisations want Parliament to be open and transparent, and the good parliaments see the value in the openness and transparency and want to participate as well. So working with other organisations outside parliaments is a great idea for everybody concerned, particularly the public at large. Whilst digital technologies bring many benefits and opportunities for parliaments and parliamentarians, they also come with challenges and things that we have to manage and mitigate if we're to use the technology effectively and improve the efficiency and accessibility of the institution. The World e-Parliament report highlights a number of these factors, and three of which I'm going to talk about specifically this morning, which are training and staff competency, security and reliability, and public knowledge. In terms of staff training, we have to think about the complexity of new systems and how the speed of technological change is leading to a much more technologically complex and challenging institution. The IT department for most parliaments has increased dramatically over the last 10, 15 or 20 years to become a significant core part of the business operation. And keeping technology staff trained and up to date in the latest tools and platforms is challenging. But we also have to think about how technology transforms the business process of Parliament. Technology doesn't just change the back end, it changes the front end. So those staff who are working on the committees, the plenary sessions, the back office of Parliament, in terms of processing documents and legislation and amendments and dealing with the public and communications, are all affected by technology, as are members of Parliament as well. So we have to think about technology holistically, not just in terms of training and key skill competencies for technical staff, but for parliamentary staff across the estate as well, and for members and people who are working in the members' offices. And this is challenging. We are finding it hard to keep up with the change of technology, finding it hard to keep pace with the demand for skills, and it presents challenges for parliaments right across the institution. And we read a lot today about hacking and disinformation and the reliability of information technology systems. When it goes wrong, we notice it. And so that's the same for parliaments. We have to have systems that work. And there is some reservation, particularly we've seen amongst members when we surveyed them, of how they feel about the reliability of the technology they're using, and definitely concerns for them about the security of it and authenticity of it. So how secure are the systems that we have in parliaments? Are they safe and protected from hacking? How much is invested in the security infrastructure of the institution? And how much time and money do we spend protecting the assets of members and the reputation of members as well? Because disinformation is spread very easily. We've seen how social media tools have been used to intentionally discredit and to mislead. And this is a major concern for members of all political persuasions in many, many countries and parliaments around the world. And it's a problem for the institution as well, because parliaments are responsible, mature institutions that are there to be respected and held up as advocates for strong democracy. And yet, if that information isn't safe and secure and can't be trusted, that raises questions about the whole validity of the parliamentary process. So safety and security of data and of individuals and of their reputation and of the information that's being produced is very, very important within the technological discussions that we're having at the moment about how parliaments advance in the digital age. A third issue that we've seen come to the fore in terms of the digital parliament is not really about digital, but it is relevant because it's the public's understanding of who Parliament is, what Parliament does, how Parliament works, and the roles that members of Parliament play in mediating and representing citizens. Now, whilst that isn't technology based itself, it's mediated by the technology, because increasingly what we've seen is the internet and new social media tools have broken down the barriers of time and space between us as individuals and public institutions, and parliaments are just part of those public institutions that the public now expects to be able to get access to and to see what's happening in much more detail, places under much more scrutiny. And it wants to know what's going on, and typically, as we've seen, I'm talking to you from the United Kingdom, and as we've seen here, there's considerable lack of understanding in the media, never mind amongst the public, about the operation of Parliament and what it does and how it functions. So we have to look at those three issues, the training and skill sets of staff, not just technical staff, but right through the whole parliamentary estate and for members as well. We have to look at the security of our IT systems and the credibility of the information held and produced by those systems. And we have to look at how we're educating the public to understand what they're now seeing more of and what they're now able to be more and more part of. If we're trying to build more participatory and open parliaments, then we also have to think about how we educate people to see their role in being part of that wider democratic process. Highlighting this question of openness and accessibility for the public, here's an interesting little graphic that shows that most parliaments are producing some form of accessible data or information that the public can get hold of. But what we're seeing is a lot of this is still in document format. It's mostly PDFs, portable document format. And that's okay in some cases. A person can sit and read it, and it's certainly better than it not being there. But it's not good for machine readable systems. So if we're trying to advance the publishing of parliamentary data and make it accessible to more and more people, we need to look at the bubbling up of more technical data products. So where we have application programming interfaces, APIs, or where we have data produced in XML or JSON that other third parties such as PMOs and civil society organisations can access live in real time and do extra things with. We're looking at not just publishing data, but seeing the data that parliaments produce today as being the source material for some kind of value-added product that's helping citizens understand democracy, understand parliamentary and democratic processes in a much stronger and in-depth way, and encouraging them to get involved and take their part in the more direct process that we're now able to deliver through technology and through the internet. If that's what's happening with parliaments, what's going to happen in the future? Well, I think the trends are relatively clear in some areas. We're going to see increasing movement towards the digitisation of parliaments. We're going to see an increasing use of digital systems in the back office function of parliaments. And we're already seeing this with the larger parliaments that are now absolutely reliant on digital platforms and digital tools. This is going to sweep through parliaments over the next, well, who likes to predict, but let's say 10 years, until we see Parliament as a digital function. None of that takes away from the history or the protocol of parliaments. That just requires a different way of thinking. So we have to think about the transformation of our parliamentary processes and how they will adapt and adopt new technologies so that we don't lose the important aspects of Parliament, the tradition and the protocol and the procedures. But equally, we're not held to ways of doing business that are no longer applicable for the modern age, and we don't miss out on opportunities that are there through the technologies. And we've seen very clearly in the World e-Parliament report series that there are significant benefits that digital tools bring to Parliament in terms of efficiency, in terms of managing the legislative drafting process, and particularly amendments and revisions, and how we take that process forward in a way that opens it up and leads to greater public understanding and scrutiny. Indeed, what we're seeing now is an increasing role for the public in the work of Parliament through digital technology, but also digital technology enabling us to go out to create face-to-face meetings. So technology is a connector. It's a really good enabler of networking and connections. It's not always the best way of having a conversation. So we're going to see more parliaments using technology to bring the public into the parliamentary process in a number of ways. We've seen lots happen already in terms of the public being brought more and more into the committee process, looking for wider views from different people, to broadening the input into parliamentary work. When it comes to post-legislative scrutiny, again being able to draw on a much broader audience and much greater depth of experience from the traditional people that would be involved in talking to parliaments. So digital is a very, very good enabler of that network and connectivity function. It helps us reach out and find people and draw them in. Where it's not really doing a great job is bringing them in a live sense to what's happening. So online conversations tend to be a bit fraught. They still tend to be a little bit shouty, if you like. There's a lot of loud voices tend to dominate these conversations. So we've got a lot of work to do in this area in terms of how we manage online digital conversations and topics. But I think we're going to see more and more in terms of the use of digital as a tool for connectivity and bringing people together. And that brings us into the idea of wider transparency and scrutiny for parliaments, and how parliaments have seen significant increase in both the demand for but also the availability of information that they're producing. The transparency and scrutiny function is absolutely vital if we're to shine a light on corruption and if we're to ensure the building of public trust in the parliamentary institution, something that has suffered significantly in a number of countries over recent years. So we have to make sure the public can see what's going on, can see that what's going on is legitimate, and can understand the process. And technology plays an important role in this through open publishing, and projects such as the Open Government Partnership, for example, as well as a lot of the work that's been done with parliamentary monitoring organisations, particularly in Latin America, where this is very strong, has helped shine a light on corruption and corrupt practices in Parliament, to hopefully the long-term benefit of the public trust in the institution. I think public trust always takes a hit when these things are exposed, but actually long-term what we show is that an open parliament, a transparent parliament, is a trusted parliament, and that we can use technology as a tool, and a very powerful tool, for building transparency and trust in parliaments. Which makes me think about one of the advances we're seeing in digital technologies at the moment, which is artificial intelligence. Where does artificial intelligence fit for a parliament, you think? It's a strange topic in some ways, but we're already seeing a number of parliaments experimenting with the idea of using AI tools in improving legislative drafting. So the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies is doing a significant amount of work in this area and has a very, very interesting project. We've seen the European Parliament look at some of these tools and at building vast databases of legislation that can help it. And Austria as well, as an example of a slightly smaller parliament, is experimenting in where AI technologies can help focus members' access to information by trying to strain out what's real from what isn't. AI presents some challenges because AI is fundamentally algorithm based. It has to learn. The definition of artificial intelligence is that it's computer based learning. The software is able to do things, learn from them, improve and refine that process. But who tells it what's right? Who writes those algorithms and who controls them? So in terms of introducing AI to parliaments, we've got some interesting ethical challenges ahead in the case of how we manage algorithms and who is responsible for them, and how open and transparent those algorithms and artificial intelligence systems and the smarts behind them are to public scrutiny. If you present it in the rather science fiction way of the computers writing the law, I think we'd all be rather worried. But when we present it in a slightly calmer, more realistic way of what the system is able to do is smooth the flow for drafting so that the language used and the construction of law is more likely to be correct and pass and more understandable for people, then we can see that as a positive. So early days with artificial intelligence, but we are making some progress with it. All of this leads us back to that question of training. It leads us back to capacity. And how do parliaments increase not just the capacity of individuals, but the technological and intellectual capacity of the institution itself? How do we improve parliaments themselves? And we're doing a lot of work in the Centre for Innovation in Parliament to build hubs to connect parliaments together, to share learning, share understanding, and to do research together on new technologies and new practices. So we're looking at open data, we're looking at artificial intelligence, and we're also looking at building capacity in terms of using IT systems for parliaments. And this is really important work because what we see is one parliament alone can find it very, very hard to make the improvements and find out what's going on. And parliaments are very unique institutions, so being able to learn and share with each other is very, very important. And part of the future trend is to increase this capacity for sharing knowledge and information and resources and for the exchange of ideas so that we're not reinventing the wheel and we're trying to identify what's good practice and learn from it and share it as much as possible. And this is going to help us in a number of ways. It's going to help us in terms of using the social tools, so we experience disinformation and we experience challenges with these tools in very similar ways in all the parliaments. And whilst local legislation and local conditions can be slightly different, there's some good practice things that we can learn from that. Same about open data. We can see how opening up data sets helps improve connection and trust with the public, and also we can see ways of doing that, so we can save a lot of time in terms of parliaments who are new to these areas investigating and reinventing the wheel by sharing what we already know. All of this comes about because the world has changed. The public wants to see what Parliament is doing more than it ever has before. It wants to understand the work of Parliament and it wants to be involved in democracy. It wants to be involved in what members are saying and doing. It wants to understand the laws that are being made and how they are affected by them. And they want to see what Parliament has done. They want to hold Parliament to account. It's not enough to do this every electoral cycle. They now want to see what their members of Parliament are saying, what they're doing about things, how they are influenced from outside, where the lobbying comes from. We need to hold a light to lobbying and transparency and corruption so that the public can see parliaments are genuine, legitimate, functioning parliaments that can be trusted. And all of this is building from, if you like, a low base. But one of the key trends that we're going to see in the next few years is the increasing access to parliamentary information, and increasingly our parliaments are thinking about usability of information. They are thinking about how the public wants to access that information. It's not just a case of here's a document and publishing it. It's a case of thinking through the end uses for that data and how individuals and civil society organisations can add value by using that data and taking that data further. So overall, to summarise, what we see is, if we look at the trends in the last 4 years, we're seeing parliaments that are now more and more digital, far more online, far more open and transparent and accountable, and thinking beyond producing a document, but producing a data solution that others can use and add value to, and bring more people into the parliamentary conversation. This is about making parliaments open, accessible and available to the public, giving them a credibility in a new digital world, giving them a new place in the digital society, if you like. And that's not an elite sitting on the hill, that's down where the people are, bringing people into those conversations, engaging more and more people in the work of Parliament, and asking more and more people what they think when it comes to legislation and legislative review. Parliaments in the last 10 years have transformed from very closed institutions into very open conversational institutions, and we've got a long way to go. But with the advent of more social tools and artificial intelligence, we're going to see much more connectivity, much more openness, and more parliamentary information being accessible to more people. And I think this is a good thing. So thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the event, and I hope that this input to it was useful. Please do get in touch with me. My contact details are available from the organisers and on this presentation, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about any aspects of this presentation, or of the work that we're doing in the Centre for Innovation in Parliament, or about the World e-Parliament report. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.